Hello, and welcome to the Global Hearth. My name is Emma Rose Lynn. I'm your host, and today we're in conversation with Professor Joe Weaver, staff researcher Avi Locke, and student researcher Bella Albiani. By way of introduction, Joe is a co-director of the Center for Global Health, a research center hosted by the Global Studies Institute. She's also a faculty member in the Department of Global Studies within the Schnitzer School of Global Studies and Languages. Her research focuses on the complex intersection of structural inequality and chronic stress, and she studies health outcomes among some of society's most vulnerable populations. Currently, she's co-leading a National Science Foundation-funded study alongside UO biological anthropologist Professor Josh Snodgrass into how houselessness affects physical well-being. Their work partners with community organizations here in Eugene and Springfield that provide trauma-informed integrative healthcare to the houseless community, and the work embodies an approach that bridges academic research with compassionate action. Avi Locke is a 2025 UO graduate with a Bachelor of Science in Biological Anthropology and Multidisciplinary Science. Congratulations, Avi. Woo. And Bella Albiani is an undergraduate researcher who's been on the project since spring of 2024. Both Bella and Avi assist with data analysis as well as day-to-day operations, and today we'll get to understand more of what you all have been learning over the course of this project. Welcome to the Global Hearth, Bella, Avi, and Joe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Glad
you.
to be here.
Absolutely. Joe, I wonder if, for listeners who may not be familiar, could you describe medical anthropology? What is it and what drew you to it?
Sure. So I'll start with what drew me to it. Like many of my current students at UO, I expected to go into medical school. And as an undergrad, I had a biology major. But partway through my studies, I sort of through random happenstance ended up on a short-term study abroad program in India. And as part of that program, I stumbled across almost literally a Hansen's disease or leprosy colony, which to my young mind at the time was shocking. I didn't know that Hansen's disease still existed and that people still got it and lived in colonies as a result of it. And the kind of social complexity and the mystery of that to me as an outsider kind of caused me to change my path. So I did graduate with a biology major, but I added foci in South Asian studies since I had been in India. And I ended up going back for a year to spend time with and do research with folks who lived in this colony, and came out the other side with sort of a thesis-like document about their lives and how this illness had impacted their family lives, their everyday lives, in particular how stigma worked for them, because Hansen's is a highly stigmatized disease. And that put me on the path towards medical anthropology, which is a study of exactly that. What is the sort of the social meaning of disease, and how do we understand in culturally specific perspectives how health and illness are understood, how people grapple with them. And that's sort of how I ended up in medical anthropology and also how I would define it.
Is that a common specialty in global health, or is it one of a constellation of specialties that make up the study of global health?
So it is a subdiscipline of anthropology. I also have a master's degree in global health, but that is an entirely separate field with an entirely separate trajectory. So anthropology sits typically within colleges of social sciences and arts. It's a subdiscipline of cultural anthropology, and it is a fairly popular focus within anthropology, but it's one of many. Anthropology is such a broad field that includes the study of humans from ancient perspectives, from language perspectives, from biological perspectives, and from cultural perspectives. So my approach is kind of one slice of a subfield. It's a subfield of a subfield within cultural anthropology. Again, fairly popular because it does interface really nicely with global health and with kind of contemporary concerns around health and wellness. But it's just one slice of that field.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that. I want to turn our attention towards the project that brought us all here to the studio today, which is that, Joe, you and Josh Snodgrass are co-principal investigators on a research project right now that's funded by the National Science Foundation. And the project is called Homelessness and Health, Integrating Structural, Social, and Behavioral Pathways. And it studies how stress and housing insecurity affect health among people experiencing houselessness. And I wonder if you could share the origin story of this project. How did it begin? Can you share that story with us?
Sure. Yeah, I think like all big, complicated projects. It began with lots of different people, some of whom are here today and some of whom aren't. So at least from my perspective, I moved here to the West Coast in 2018. Prior to that, I had lived in Georgia and Alabama for about 15 years, doing grad school and then having my first faculty role at the University of Alabama. And I had never lived on the West Coast. So one of the first things that popped up to me, other than the rain and the cold weather, was that homelessness looks really different here than in any other part of the US where I've lived, and also different than any other part of the world where I've lived. My work has taken me to long stays in India, Brazil, Bangladesh. Homelessness exists in all these places, but it looks really different than it does here on the West Coast. So that really struck me and piqued my concern and my interest as somebody who studies health inequality. And then it just so happened that a constellation of other forces came together and made this project doable. A key one was a graduate student on the project who was an undergrad at the time, Mackenzie Neef Lane here at UO, who at the time that I met her was a co-executive director of a local organization that does sort of medical outreach and service provision called Black Thistle Street Aid here in Eugene. So this was a student who had a huge amount of lived experience in understanding and working with people who were experiencing homelessness. She and also Black Thistle ended up being key partners in the earlier phases of the project and then into the present in different and evolving ways too. And that was one piece. And then having collaborators here at UO who were also interested in that topic. So having Josh be interested in that allowed us to, and our colleague Zach Dubois in anthropology, who's also an investigator on the project, having those thinking partners helped us to come up with a project that would be locally relevant, that had local connection from the start, and also that was kind of a collaboration across those subfields of anthropology that I mentioned earlier. So this is really a very interdisciplinary project that draws on cultural anthropology, medical anthropology, but also biological anthropology. So it was a combination of, me moving here and being struck by my concern around homelessness and the fact that we have so much visible health inequality in our community, and also having thinking partners who have been key players throughout this whole project.
Wow. Avi and Bella, welcome. We're so glad that you're here with us today. And I know you both have really intimate knowledge of this project as well and have been working on it for a number of years. I wonder if you both could share what your day-to-day work looks like on this project and maybe a specific moment in the field or lab that sticks with you that has really informed how you either view this project in its context or has changed your approach as a scientist.
This is Bella Albiani speaking.
I came in as a sophomore and now I'm in my last year of college. So it's definitely been a growth experience for me, but I kind of came in working directly under Joe and was able to get involved almost immediately with our data collection, which is really cool. We're out in the field talking to people. I would often lead our informed consent. So meeting people, telling them about our study, and then if they're interested, enrolling them more in what are the risks, what are the benefits. And that was really cool because it helped me get a really comprehensive overview of the study and then intersect it with every participant that we worked with, I got to talk to. And then along the way, I started to learn how to do the interviews. We have structured interviews with a questionnaire. So I was doing those. And then later on, I also learned how to do our biomarkers, which is kind of point of care health testing. So we use a finger prick and we are able to tell people a couple of different health values. And we use those in our studies, but we also return them back to our participants. So I've been able to do a little bit of all of that. And then in the day-to-day right now, I've started to get more into our lab. And so I've learned how to run a couple of the different analyses that we run with our samples. We're working on developing a couple more right now. So that's been really cool. I am focused a lot in biology in my undergrad. And so being able to have those lab skills, but also those person skills has been really rewarding.
Wow, thank you. Avi, I wonder if you might share what your involvement has looked like as well.
So I started when I was still an undergrad, junior year, I want to say. I've been on the project for about 3 years, and it evolved out of the fact that I worked as an EMT in 2020 for about 2 years. And so I had left that work. I was still certified, and I was in a class with Joe. And I also was doing undergraduate research with Josh on some other projects. When the two of them separately told me about this project, I knew I really wanted to be involved. Day-to-day morphed a lot. I kind of came in as a biomarker person who was also an EMT. I could be there for wound care. I could be there for general interaction. And most of what I did was biomarkers to start. I have since been trained on everything else. So I've also done the structured interviews. I've also done informed consent. When I graduated, I ended up taking over from our previous staff researcher, Alyssa, who had been doing work with us both in biomarkers and in analyses. And now I run the lab that does our dried blood spot analysis. So I've been working on developing the assay for us to look at hormones within our dried blood spots. And Bella and I are going to be running those sometime in the next month. As far as things that have stood out to me, there's nothing that compares, I think, to the generosity I've learned is possible to exist by virtue of this community and the way they care for each other. I have very visceral moments of witnessing people giving half of what they have to another by virtue of that person needing it more than they currently did. Each example of living outside that I encountered on this project and elsewhere comes to me really as an example of not only survival, but of incredible generosity that they must figure out how to function with, even as there's violence everywhere.
Well stated. Yeah.
Yeah, well said. Thank you. I'm curious about what it might look like to enter conversation with medical equipment and coming from an institution like the university to begin relationship with people. You've used the word informed consent, Bella, and I wonder if you could share a little bit about what that process has looked like. What do you want to make sure that the study participant understands, and how do you discern whether or not there's true informed consent?
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the most important questions that we can kind of consider and practice as researchers. And I think for me, it comes from just really showing up myself as ready, prepared, and kind of open to people, but also kind of existing in a space where I'm reciprocating how someone's coming. So if they're high energy, I'll be high energy. If they maybe are quieter, I'll be quieter, and try to kind of meet someone where they're at. As much as there's things that we have to say and we kind of have a form that we go through and there are key points that we make sure to emphasize and that people understand, turning that into a conversation. So telling people, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it. I always think that it's important to start with that why and kind of start with who we are and why we're here, because like you said, we're kind of an institution, and these are people who have experienced, I think, a lot of the time high levels of institutional harm. And so coming at that with a lot of honesty and openness is important. And then, turning that into a conversation and making it very clear that at any point someone can ask you questions. At any point you can ask questions back to them, ensure that people are understanding, have them kind of repeat key points back to you. And then making sure, I think, that people know as they're kind of moving through this process, which can ask, invasive questions or ask for a finger prick or ask for things that, maybe are a little bit uncomfortable. They know at any point that we are not here to just extract information from them, right? We are here to support them, and we want them to be comfortable. We don't want them to be harmed by their participation in our research. And so we're here to listen, and we're here to let them guide us through what they're comfortable doing and what they're not comfortable doing.
I'm curious to explore that why a little bit more. And I wonder, Joe, if there's a way you could help us understand how this project fits into the existing research that's available in the houseless community. And could you help us understand, was there a gap or what kind of purpose or service is this research filling in the larger body of work?
Yeah, good question. There is an increasing amount of research happening around people who are experiencing varying levels of housing insecurity, but very little of it, if any, that I'm aware of, is taking an approach that kind of considers both people's lived experience as they report it on a questionnaire and people's lived experience as we can measure it using physiological biomarkers, and considers people's own narratives in a less structured way. So our research does all three of those. And I think that most of the work that I'm familiar with out there does one of those three.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know of anyone who's doing two of the three or all three of the three other than us. And I think that's really important because people have incredibly complex stories. And if you only get questionnaire responses, then you're missing their own sort of lived narrative of what their life is like, what it feels like, what feels good about it, what feels challenging about it. Likewise, if you only have the physiological measures, you can say something about where people's sort of psychosocial stress is, but you can't know much about why it is where it is or what it feels like to have those experiences. And I think finally, if you have only people's narratives of their experience, that's really important, but it limits our ability to understand how the things they narrate in an interview are impacting their health and well-being. So the combination of those three is really kind of the magic to me of this project. And that's a model I've used in every other research project I've been in charge of, has incorporated all three of those. So I was excited to be able to do that here. I think also there's very little research that's been done around the phenomenon of homelessness as it currently exists in smaller communities. So most of the research that is coming out around housing and housing insecurity and the experience of homelessness is coming from very large cities, places like Los Angeles, New York City, Seattle. And we know that there are different challenges associated with homelessness as it's now appearing in smaller and mid-sized cities like Eugene. So that's another kind of gap that we are hoping to fill with this work, because Eugene is not the only mid-sized city in the country that is dealing with increasing levels of this challenge. From sort of like a tax-based perspective, there's just different things that can and can't be done at a structural level to help support people who are struggling with housing in a smaller city as opposed to a larger city. I'm still trying to parse apart what actually that looks like. It's not always a negative thing necessarily to have a smaller community, but that's one of the bigger sort of background questions that we're hoping to get at as well.
In the scope of the project, this is a 3-year endeavor. Yeah?
It's more like 5 at this point.
5 years?
Well,
Yeah.
4 to 5 and going on 6.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could you orient us to kind of what phase of development we're in right now, what's happened so far, maybe even like what questions are most compelling to you in this phase of the research and what you're interested in exploring as it continues?
Sure. So originally, we were planning on working with 3 different groups of folks who are experiencing different kinds of housing challenges. And I would say that's another thing that's unique about this work. We're focusing on folks who are experiencing what the US government would define as unsheltered houselessness, which is living without HUD-defined shelter. So that could mean living in a car, living in a tent. We're also working with folks who are experiencing what the US government refers to as sheltered homelessness. So that might be couch surfing or staying in nighttime shelters that are open only during certain hours, and then people have to leave during the day. And then the third group is folks who have experienced houselessness of one sort or another, but who have now transitioned into a permanent supportive housing arrangement, which is considered kind of the gold standard for addressing homelessness. It's meant to be housing that is subsidized and that includes a case manager and services that help people get access to the things that they need once they've transitioned into housing. So things like healthcare, navigating the workplace, managing, getting identity documents and things like that that people need in order to establish secure long-term housing. So we're working with all 3 of those groups. And at the moment, we started off working mostly outdoors. So working with trying to reach folks who are experiencing unsheltered and maybe sheltered homelessness to an extent. That was the first couple of years of active research. And we've now wrapped up that part of the project for the most part and are working with a group of folks who have transitioned from chronic unsheltered homelessness into a new permanent supportive housing facility that's actually fairly close to campus. It's very interesting to have spent a lot of time immersed in working with folks who are actively experiencing various forms of housing insecurity, and then to now be, I don't want to say on the other side because this is a continuum and people move back and forth between these different housing settings, but to be now working with folks who have moved out of homelessness into a permanent supportive housing facility is a really different view on this experience. Also, a lot of it is very similar, right? So it's not that people, transition from unsheltered homelessness into permanent supportive housing and then everything is different right away. So one of the questions that I think is really interesting right now that's guiding the work we're doing with folks who've moved into this facility is, what is that transition process like? I think we tend to assume that getting housing is the end of houselessness and that it will always be a positive and beneficial thing for people. But we're finding that's not always the case, right? There's a lot actually at stake that people lose when they choose to move into permanent supportive housing facility, especially around social connection. And that can be a really challenging transition. And that is not something that we've seen any research on at all. So what is it? What is the lived experience of transitioning from unsheltered homelessness into a housing facility where you have access to a shower, a bathroom, a door that closes, a bed, but you also might be really isolated, and that can come with its own kinds of risks. So that question of sort of what is this process like for folks and what are the challenges and benefits that they see to this housing arrangement is really driving our work right now.
Wow. I really appreciate the level of specificity that this kind of research brings to this conversation. At least in my experience in the public discourse, it's really easy to put a veneer or there's sort of like a assumption of what's going on. And that this project seems to be like, well, what's actually going on? We're actually asking more questions about what people's lived experience is and understanding even the nuances of the different types of houselessness that people might experience. That in and of itself is already opening a conversation that if you've never experienced houselessness, I imagine may not even occur as something to consider.
We hope so.
Yeah. Thank you for opening that up a little bit for myself, but also for the larger conversation. Maybe it's too early to ask this question, but I'm curious, Avi, if maybe you could speak to some of the biomarker data that you've seen and what you've noticed, either in respect to these different populations and the way they're experiencing homelessness or the general stress markers that you're able to determine through that research.
Yeah, so I'm happy to speak to what I can at this point. So most of what we collect as far as biomarkers go is on site. So we've done our best to not only, because I'm simply an EMT, we've also done our best to have a nurse or a physician on site who's volunteering their time with us in such a way that if folks who participate in our project want to ask further questions about their point of care markers, they are able to. There is a lot to be expected in that living outside unsheltered, living with risk to your housing is stressful on levels that are both physiological and mental and impact every aspect of existence. We're interested in looking at that in a few different ways. So we do things like a lipid panel. So we look at people's cholesterol on site and we can give them that data right away. We can do the same for their blood sugar levels and we can do the same for something called HbA1c, which is basically a way of averaging out your blood sugar over the course of 3 months. And you can often use that as a way of measuring diabetes risk. It's usually something that is used in a panel of diagnosing diabetes for folks as well. We also look at hemoglobin, so kind of like a measure of anemia. Those are all kind of part of a constellation of the different ways that you can look at stress in the body. And then we also take hair to look at cortisol levels, but that has to be analyzed in the lab. And so if folks want that back, if they have contact information, we're able to give that back to them. And then we're also looking at C-reactive protein, which is kind of a measure of inflammation. And while it's not super clinically relevant in terms of how you can do anything about it, it is relevant in the context of thinking about like broader health and how stress is showing up in the body. While we haven't gone through full analyses of all of this data at this point, and the C-reactive protein isn't finished, we've been anecdotally finding high levels of cortisol for folks, which is approximately a centimeter of hair correlates to about a month of growth, and therefore about a month of deposits of cortisol. We haven't finished with all of that yet, but we have found multiple folks with unreadable levels of cortisol, as in it's so high that our measurement isn't able to measure it. We've found some interesting things regarding like point of care testing. Bella's done a lot of the statistics for that and some of the communication around statistics for the things we've been noticing.
Yeah, I would say in general, we're noticing a significant portion of our sample has like high blood pressure, even compared to kind of the general adult population. We have found some people who have maybe like a clinically relevant marker of diabetes, a small percentage, but a couple of people who maybe weren't aware that that might be something they should look into. I would say in general with the biomarker values that we've analyzed so far, people are in those like high risk or at risk kind of ranges with these values, a higher percentage of people in our population that we're working with than say the general population of adults in the US. And we'll have more information kind of as we pursue more analyses, but I would say that's the general pattern that we've observed so far.
So getting a sense of not necessarily is the houseless population experiencing higher level of stress, but more so to what degree and how is it showing up and what care might be needed or be available to the population based on this data. Is that something that you're able to learn from it?
Maybe we need to go into the weeds a little bit on this. So one thing that we're attempting to get at with these various, what we call biomarkers, so measures of physiological states, is what we refer to as allostatic load, which is a term that is used in human biology and biological anthropology and allied fields, psychoneuroendocrinology, et cetera, to refer to the amount of wear and tear that accumulates in the body's systems as a result of chronic overactive stress responses. So the way we measure allostatic load is not very standardized in research, and it's not something that is clinically useful at all. But the goal of each of these biomarkers is to basically represent a different major physiological system. So we're trying to get at the endocrine system by looking at the stress hormone cortisol. We're getting at the cardiovascular system by looking at blood pressure, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, looking at cholesterol helps us access that too. Endocrine system is measured through cortisol, but also through our diabetes screeners. And so kind of taken together as a whole picture in a research context, these measures give us more than just insights about specific health conditions, but can also point to people's overall kind of health picture. That kind of measure is useful in populations that we expect to be highly stressed. It's also useful to parse those apart into the individual measures that we were just talking about, because some of them are clinically relevant and are things that people should know about their health. So they get treated kind of in terms of response to participants in a different way than they do in our research. In our research, we're looking at this kind of complex construct of allostatic load. In front of our participants, we're producing results that we give back to them that are clinically useful, but that represent specific conditions and specific risks. I think Bella and Avi are correct that overall we're seeing the very high levels of stress markers that we would expect. We haven't finished analyzing all those components of allostatic load yet, nor have we combined them into an allostatic load measure. That's why we're hedging a little. We're not exactly sure where this is going, but again, looking at those individual measures, it's pretty clear that people who are in our study are experiencing much higher levels of concerning measurements than a general population of their same kind of age and demographic, which we would expect given that this is a very stressful situation. The same goes for health diagnoses. So we do ask people to share with us diagnoses they've received. Most people have multiple health diagnoses, many of them falling into various categories. So physical health, mental health, otherwise. And a lot of people also report high symptoms of things like depression and anxiety, again, at a higher level than the general population that would match their same demographics.
Thank you. I'm hearing the bidirectionality of the research and just how you are all kind of positioned in terms of like evaluating the biomarkers and being in relationship, and kind of what you spoke to earlier about the informed consent and the kind of humanist side of conducting these interviews, but then also taking that research to the lab and doing the analysis in a way that's going to further our understanding of the complexity of the problem as a whole. Joe, I wonder if you could help me understand how this phase of your research connects to some of the work that you've done globally. You've worked both in Brazil and India. You've been studying food insecurity for a long time now, as you shared already with us. And I'm wondering how your interactions with Eugene community members have either deepened or complicated any of your prior understanding, and how this work kind of fits into the larger scope of what you do.
Not coincidentally, Bella's undergraduate thesis is focusing on this question of food insecurity, so I will defer to Bella on some of that as well. But I guess I'll just say that I have considered how I might bring my international work into conversation directly with this work that I'm doing locally. This is the first US-based project I've ever done. Most of my work, as you said, is international and intercultural. So far, what I've been able to conclude is mostly what I teach in my courses here at UO, which is we have to be careful about generalizing, right? So the experience of people here is really not the same in whether we're looking at food insecurity or other elements of challenge that people are dealing with as the things that people in the rural Brazilian community where I've worked experience. We call them the same thing, right? We could call them food insecurity, but the antecedents, the conditions, the structures, the policies, the foodways that kind of feed into that experience of food insecurity are so radically different across these contexts that I hesitate actually to bring them into close conversation with one another because to me, these are distinct populations with really, really distinct cultural, policy, national histories. And, we do try to kind of think big in this kind of research about what are the larger structural causes and consequences of individual lived challenges of the kinds that we deal with, food insecurity, health inequality, et cetera. Because one thing we don't want to do in this research or in any of my other research is place the onus of those challenges onto individuals when we know that it's structural, big policy level choices that put certain people in the way of health harms and health risks while other people are spared those things. So that's why I'm pointing here, I think, to structures and policies and these kinds of histories, these big factors that we might not think of as being directly related to the individual experience that people have with food insecurity, for example. And it's our job as researchers to understand those broader structures and conditions in which our research participants are living. And that's part of what I try to do in all my work. So maybe that is a way that my work is similar across contexts. And maybe that is also part of why I haven't, people have asked me before, for example, why don't you do a cross-cultural study of homelessness? I've really thought about that, but what homelessness looks like right now in Eugene, Oregon is so radically different from what it might look like in a slum outside of New Delhi or what it might look like in a favela in Sao Paulo or Rio, that I hesitate to actually draw direct comparisons.
I'm hearing this theme crop up over and over of what you spoke to about taking care not to overgeneralize, not to assume knowledge, to ask more questions than to arrive with answers. And I'm hearing that as a common theme across the work, but also as someone who lives in Eugene, who's been a part of this community, as we all have, that there's also an immediacy to what I hear you saying about Eugene houselessness is specific to the Eugene microculture, which also places a different level of care and accountability on everyone who lives in this community. And I hear that invitation and it resonates. It makes sense to me as someone who lives as part of this community that it would be on us to interface with this issue in a way that's specific to this ecosystem.
And I think it's an invitation to look both up and down. So we sit as, presumably for the 5 of us in the room, we are housed with comparatively little experience of being unsheltered. And with access to education, we also have the ability to kind of look up at the ways that people who have even more privilege than us are enforcing this violence. And that's part of why we're researchers, is so that we can examine not only what might one person be feeling, but also like how, from a sociological perspective, like what policies are going through and what local elections can influence and what nonprofits can influence. I think that Joe and Josh and Mackenzie are doing this really well in that they are encouraging not only through the intersectionality, but also through who they are as people and also through how we want to work with this community, that there is nuance and there's individuality and there is an onus on us and what we bring forward to support the honesty that people have brought us by participating. And need transcends simply food and shelter into the social. And I think that's something that anthropology does really well.
I'm wondering what we think that this work might be able to accomplish on a policy level or on a structural level. What kinds of avenues are available to us when we have this level of specificity of knowledge and care kind of working hand in hand? What do we want to see happen?
I think what's hard is you can bring so much of yourself and so much of these kind of values and how you want to show up and how you want to ask questions into a research space. And as an anthropologist, you have like a lot of tools for that, which is super cool. But I think there definitely is a frustration in turning kind of really nuanced, complicated information into something that can be kind of clearly implemented. And so I'm kind of a policy-minded person. And at 19 years old, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to join this project. We're going to like figure out how to solve homelessness. And of course, we're not there, right? This is a really complex, complicated issue that just involves human beings and needs a complex, complicated amount of care and attention. And so I think what can be called upon most in what we have now is the fact that systems of support and care, they need to be flexible. They need to be longstanding. They need to have different levels of support for different kinds of people. They need to not provide an easy fix. I think we're all kind of looking for that. Mm-hmm. And it's really easy as people, and I think especially from kind of a policymaker standpoint of, I want to fix my community. I want to make lives better for people, right? Anyone in power and in government and who is controlling these systems, we would hope that's kind of the values that they're bringing to this space. And I think the answer that we might have is that it's not easy and it's not simple, and you need to create a system that prioritizes this level of empathy and care and individualism for these people that I think maybe people wouldn't think is important. What we can speak to is the fact that that is radically important, right? Having services for people, having support for people that not only addresses this like basic need, right? Giving people food, but how do you give people food that fills them up, that makes them feel whole, that builds community? It's so much more than just giving someone calories. Mm-hmm. But I think definitely encouraging these more complex systems of care and solutions that are really prioritizing empathy and the humanity of the people that you're trying to help, which isn't a clear-cut, magical solution. But I would say that's my biggest takeaway, and that's what I would encourage anyone who's looking for what would be a good program, what would be a good practice, what would be a good strategy. I think really implementing those elements of flexibility and compassion.
Yeah. Our project is not going to solve homelessness. Mm-hmm. I so wish that it could. I think in terms of concrete things we're trying to do to bridge that challenging gap that Bella just described between being researchers who are trying to add nuance and complication to our understanding of this really complex and nuanced situation, and trying to bridge that so that it's digestible for a broader public is always a challenge. Things we're doing concretely in that regard include presentations back to community groups and stakeholders that we've already been in touch with and worked with. This is just beginning, but for example, when I first decided I wanted to start this research, I reached out to neighborhood associations in Eugene and talked with neighborhood association members who are housed and who have concerns and questions and are curious about and want to help and want to understand how to respond to homelessness in our communities. So we've given a couple of share-back presentations to those organizations. We're also in the process of planning a big share-back presentation with folks who've been part of the study. We have spent time speaking with the UO trustees. We just got on the books for an OMSI pub talk in Portland. So we are going to be sharing the results of this work to the best of our ability with folks at this community level, at the county level as well. We've worked with Lane County Public Health, for example, and at the state level. The best thing we can hope for is to advocate for a need for a very high-level structural and sustained initiative. It is so unreasonable to put the onus of kind of fixing homelessness on people who are themselves experiencing it, which is often where we go. We say, why can't they get a job or whatever? It's less unreasonable, but still unreasonable to put that onus on a single institution or research group or even city. The housing crisis and housing affordability crisis is a federal, national, even international concern. And what we really need is a sustained long-term commitment from leadership around restructuring our economy. So I would like nothing less than a full restructuring of our economy to reduce the wealth gap and make housing affordable for everyone. That is what I want.
We're putting in orders.
We know that that's not what we're going to accomplish, but I do think that making small steps towards sharing what we've learned can help those who do have the ability to make policy to A, care more, and B, have a more nuanced understanding of what needs to happen.
Mm-hmm.
I think Bella's really right that we don't need just a service. We need services that are flexible and that meet people at different levels, because people experiencing homelessness are not a monolith. They're very diverse and have very diverse needs. So I think that's a real challenge at the policy level that we could hopefully help to inform directly.
I'm getting a visual or a picture of just the incredible web of connection that seems to have developed around this body of work and over the course of the study. And for anyone listening who's feeling a resonance with this work and is that concerned, curious neighbor, how might they follow along with this project and learn about any upcoming shareback sessions that are happening?
We have a website. Bella's chuckling over there because the very first thing she did on this project was help to build that website. And she has since shared with me that at the time she wasn't sure she could do it, but she did a great job.
I just needed an excuse to join the project. They were like, we need a website. And I was like, I built a website once for my sister's jewelry business in high school. So you know what? I got experience.
Yes. And she did it.
That's awesome.
So we do have a website, which we'll link in the show notes maybe for this project. There's also a larger group that has come together at UO called the Hub, the Housing and Homelessness Hub. We'll link that as well. It is a group of students, staff, and faculty who are conducting broader research on questions of housing policy, homelessness, and other related topics. And one thing that's been really heartening to learn is that there are a lot of folks on campus besides just our group who are concerned about this and thinking about it and really wanting to use their positions at UO to contribute positively to this challenge in our community, which was not something that was very visible, even to me as a researcher when I began this work. And so that's another place where people can follow along and learn more about what we're doing, but also what other folks at UO are doing around questions of housing affordability and homelessness and smart design for trauma-informed housing structures. There's just all kinds of really great work that's going on.
Very cool. If people want to directly support, are there any organizations in town that you want to shout out, or is there a way for people to donate directly to support the work that's happening?
So one of the things that I started doing in December of 2024 was there was a particularly cold data collection. Without getting graphic, it was just hard. And I came home and I bawled my eyes out and went, okay, something's got to look different. And so I started buying socks and hand warmers and water and walking around with a wagon. And we've called it distro, short for distribution. And we try to do that regularly as a group or as individuals. And so we have an Amazon wish list set up where we go hand out supplies as often as we can. We are not a nonprofit. So if you're looking for something more along those lines, Black Thistle Street Aid has done really incredible work, and they're always looking for support as well. So,
yeah, definitely.
Awesome. We'll definitely link both of those in the show notes as well for anyone who wants to jump in.
And I would say there is something about just smiling at people when you pass them on the street. And if you're heading into a coffee shop, offering to grab someone a pastry or, doing those little things that ensure people that they're a part of your community and that you recognize them and that you see them as a human being. People feel like they are being erased or don't exist because of this stigma that people have towards them in everyday society. And so I think just the little things that you can do to kind of challenge yourself, but to be a kinder human being to your neighbors is actually huge. And when we look back at those interviews and we talk to people, those are the things that make someone's day, week, that make them feel like they are human and make them feel like they can get up the next day and keep existing in a circumstance that is unimaginably difficult. Anything that you can do that you feel like you have the capacity to do to just be a good neighbor is huge as well.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bella. As we bring this conversation to a close, is there anything that hasn't been said that we want to speak to?
Have empathy.
Yeah.
And, I don't know, carry hand warmers when it's cold and water when it's hot.
Yeah. Carry Narcan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good one.
People have often asked me, like, well, what if I don't want to give or can't give money? What's something else? And a big one is like a bus pass. You know, people rely on public transport and you can buy bus passes. So if you can't or don't want to give out money, but you want to have something that you can share with folks, bus passes are always welcome. But I really think Bella said it well that, you know, one thing we hear over and over is that there are so many things about living without housing that make people feel totally outside of the system of human connection. And that outsiderness is an extremely challenging part of this. And there's a lot we can do towards just recognizing our neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
And that's super important. And is something that I think folks in this community have not done as much as they could. I think people are overwhelmed by the problem. People experience what we might refer to as compassion fatigue. So to whatever extent people can challenge that, I think is super important.
To me, that occurs as a really actionable invitation. That really what it requires is moral courage. It's showing up to the moment and making eye contact with the people who live in our communities, developing relationship, and getting a sense of who everyone is who lives in our neighborhood, which in general, I have chills right now. Like that gives me a sense that like there's actually an immense amount that we can accomplish together when we focus on that type of movement. So thank you all for speaking to that. Before we close, I have a quick fire.
Okay.
If you had a minute in an elevator with a policymaker, what would you want them to understand about houselessness preventing this rather than turning a blind eye?
We need affordable housing across the entire nation and world desperately. And that is an achievable goal, not under the current economic structure.
I would add, stop individualizing the problem. It's not these individual people that are the issue. And saying that it's a mental health crisis or that it's a drug crisis, and then using that to justify the fact that you don't have to address these people as humans is ridiculous. It's a structural issue, and you have to have structural solutions. And you have to acknowledge that when you put people in a situation where they are experiencing high levels of structural harm, they might develop coping mechanisms that aren't the coping mechanisms that you would prefer they develop. But that's not a reflection of them. That's a reflection of these larger systems that we've created.
I think it would be that the onus of who deserves to survive doesn't belong to any one institution or structure. And as someone who was an EMT during COVID in Portland, most of these folks outside have saved more lives than I will ever hope to. Through sharing warmth and food and Narcan and wound care and first aid kits and everything they have. I want to be a physician, and I can only hope to have the kind of unending compassion that I encounter on a daily basis with folks outside.
Thank you. To close, I'd love to read a poem. This is a poem from a book called Honor the Messenger, which was commissioned for the Don't Shoot the Journalist conference that the Global Studies Institute put on last year. And these poems are by Kim Stafford. They're poems for journalists in danger. This is called Wild Visioning. They say her name is Susan, and she holds these why not sessions somewhere east up the gorge. She'll ask, why should we believe only one can say, I have a dream? She says, why have freedom if we don't sing out loud the best we could ever say? So they practice wild imagining. People get fierce and joyful, saying, what if I, what if we? They start with the dark news and turn it inside out. They vision, then they plan, then they act. Once they shake things up, they're hard to stop. They summon mayors, then city councils catch the fever, then voters start to see things otherwise. Some friends went to learn what it's all about. They never came back. Now they're comets, lighting our way across the sky. And you? And I? Thank you all so much for joining us here at the Global Hearth.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you to our student producer, Ellie Johnson. Thank you to the director of the Global Studies Institute, Ellie Vandegrift, and our GSI team members, Megan Bogert and Hadil Abdelmaid. Thank you to Dean and Vice Provost of the Division of Global Engagement, Dennis Galvan, for your support and your encouragement throughout this project. Thank you to Sam Para for your work on the podcast artwork, as well as marketing and communications support. Thank you to our sound design and audio mastering interns, Journey Brinson and Julian Green. Thank you to the SOJC production studio, especially John Sharpie. Major thanks to composer Joe Kai, who composed our Global Hearth theme song. Many thanks to John Bologna, Charlie Dietz, Steve Rogers, Christopher Deredix, Peter Laufer, and Chris Chavez, and the Don't Shoot the Journalist team for concept development support. Thank you to former Oregon Poet Laureate Kim Stafford for your beautiful poetry. And most of all, thank you to you, our listeners, for your time and your caring attention. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can follow us on social media. We'll link it in the show notes. Please send any questions or comments to gsi@uoregon.edu. That's gsi@uoregon.edu. We would love to hear from you. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again at the Global Hearth, same time next week.